worked at Bain& Company for about 3 years, and when I reflect on that time, I actually remember something funny, which was that there was this path that I wanted to take after consulting, which was to go work at a startup. But for some reason, I had the impression that no startup or no CEO of a startup wanted former consultants. And I think the reason for that is there was just an absence of information of how management consultants did when they left consulting and went into the startup world. And it was weird because, I mean, if you wanted to go into private equity, there was tons of resources, tons of people you could talk to. Same thing about venture capital, business school, working in corporate America, or just like large corporations. But for startups, for some reason, there was just this lack of information of how consultants did. After consulting, I went and actually worked at an early stage startup for the last 3 years in Australia. It's one of the coolest startups ever. It's called Val. We make cultured meat, which is when you take the cells of animals and grow that into real meat. But incredibly amazing place to work, awesome experience, and I got a really good sense of what it's like to work in an early stage chaotic startup. And so with that, I wanted to make this video, which I've been wanting to make for a while, which is to talk about how do consultants actually do when they leave consulting and go work in the startup world. I'm going to talk in this video about why consultants surprisingly are actually really good startup employees, things that I'd never heard when I was working as a consultant, and then some things that if you were to take this path or you are even contemplating it, what are some things that you might want to potentially unlearn or make sure you don't pick up while you are a consultant if the goal for you is to go work at a startup afterward. Oh, and by the way, if you're new here, my name is Neil, and I often make videos with my friend Rohit about consulting and how to get in, but more and more, especially as both of us are no longer in consulting, how we can translate that career path of having worked at a consulting firm to then going and doing things that we find more fulfilling for ourselves and valuable to the world. All right, so I want to start by talking about what are the things that make consultants actually surprisingly really good in the startup world. The first one might be something that's potentially obvious for some people, less obvious for others, which is the soft skills. And this is a funny one because for me, it felt super obvious, almost table stakes, until one day I was having a one-on-one with my CEO at Val, George. And he mentioned to me, he's like, man, one thing that's really nice about hiring former consultants is that we are exceptionally good at communication, both to our teammates, but then also externally. We are also able to give and receive feedback really well, which is something that many people take for granted or you wouldn't expect. Because when you're in consulting, I was at Bain, for example, feedback was part of the culture. Every week you had to set up, professional development chats with your manager, every 2 weeks with your senior manager on the team, and then every month with your partner. And in those, you had to come prepared with feedback for them as well as feedback for yourself that they would then improve or correct. And so because of that, I was super used to giving and receiving feedback, but a lot of other employees that we had at the startup, whether it was engineers, scientists, whoever, weren't nearly as used to that. And so it made it hard for the leadership team or the CEO to then mold those employees in the right direction or give them feedback. Some people responded really well, some people didn't. Whereas people who are former consultants generally always received the feedback well and were able to action it because we're so used to that. And the other thing about the soft skills part, the last part that I'll mention for this, is we're good at building relationships and like bonds within the team. And so we value relationships. Obviously, coming from consulting, you only have your team. And so you have to really cultivate strong relationships with them. And then the same thing with your clients. We just take that habit and then bring it to the startup world and to the small company and the small team that we're a part of, which is a really awesome positive for the culture, assuming you and the culture of the company are aligned. The next reason is, I think, a non-obvious one, which is that it is super easy to supercharge a former consultant. Now, if you think about it, the reason that someone would leave consulting to go work at a startup is likely because they weren't that motivated with consulting, they weren't that excited by the work itself, and then 3, they wanted more ownership over what they were doing and less hierarchy and less of somebody else telling them what to do. Now, at a startup, you get all 3 of those. And if you're able to also then provide them the right positive reinforcements, like, complimenting their work or giving positive feedback, then you really are able to take somebody who was used to getting none of that and incredibly demotivated, yet still smart, intelligent, and hardworking, and then make them even more hardworking and more excited by their work because you're actually giving them the positive praise that they might have been lacking for the last several years while they were a consultant. And if anyone is in consulting right now, you'll understand what I mean, where while you will get some positive feedback, the way that their performance system is designed is one such that you're always going to feel like you need to push a little bit more to be able to get the proper praise that you think you deserve or to be able to get that promotion. So there's always like a carrot dangling just out of reach that makes you want to run faster and work harder. Whereas in the startup world, there's less politics, there's less bureaucracy, and you're able to just more easily get stuff done. And I think if you're someone who values the work you do, you're able to get much more reward and personal satisfaction from it. Another thing about former consultants that makes them really good in the startup world is that they know their limits. When you work in consulting, generally you're in a pretty extreme environment in terms of hours, in terms of workload, in terms of pressure. And so that forces you as an individual to really understand yourself and what you need to be able to wake up every morning and be energized for your job. And some days you'll be better at it than others, but it really helps you understand what you need. And so when you go into the startup world, another environment working wise where you'll be pushed, you're able to better handle that pressure because you know what you need and what you don't need. So you come in with almost like a little bit more professional maturity that you might not have gained as quickly if you weren't a consultant and then went into the startup world. And then the last and honestly the most important thing about why former consultants make great startup employees is that they can very effectively act as generalists. Now, usually the generalists in this sense does not mean technical. It might be more on the business side of things, whether it's operations, logistics, supply chain, finance, HR, recruiting, go-to-market, sales, marketing, those kinds of things. Things that don't necessarily require you to go to code or be like a hardware engineer or a biological scientist. Consultants are fantastic at those things. And the reason that's so important is because when you're like, at least this is my impression, having worked at Vow or worked in the startup world for now 3 years, is that at an early stage, you can't afford to hire specialists or experts as a startup. And that's for two reasons. The first one is they're just too expensive and you don't have the funding or the money for that. And then the second is a likelihood that you hire the wrong expert or you don't know who you're hiring for is really high. If you're hiring a role that no one in the company knows how to do, chances are you don't know what you need or who that person is that you actually do need. And so as a generalist, what you could do is go in and fill that gap for 3, 6, 12 months by actually doing it and likely not doing it super well. You would have a much better understanding, both for yourself and for the team that you're working for, who you need and what exactly they need to have shown in their experience set or in their interviews for you to feel comfortable hiring them. So I think basically what early startups need to be doing is having these smart generalists, oftentimes who are people who come from consulting firms, who can act as these like hole pluggers for long enough to where the company can still survive, even if they might not be doing the best job in the world, so that they can learn who they need to hire and what the problem actually is. And then they move on to the next fire and then the next fire. And so that's honestly probably the biggest value I saw in former consultants at the startup I worked at, where we hired many of them. We hired at least like 5 former consultants from what I can remember. Now, hopefully this is helpful and this encourages you as someone who might be considering consulting or already in consulting and considering leaving for a startup. But with that, I also wanted to leave you with some ideas of things that you should either unlearn or make sure you don't learn when you're in consulting. And this also applies, I think, to investment banking or other highly structured, hierarchical, and high-pressured roles when you are doing those roles and considering leaving to go do a startup. The first one is that when leaving consulting to go work at a startup, you'll have to be okay with uncertainty, both at the macro and also the micro sense. Now, when I say micro, what I mean is specifically that you're going to be joining a company that might only have 12, 24, maybe 30 months of runway. So that's just uncertainty that you need to be okay with as a consultant or as a person who goes and joins a startup. Now, of course, if you come from consulting, you might be semi-used to that uncertainty because of the occasionally stringent or tight promotion bars that consulting firms have. But if you only spent 2 to 3 years out of undergrad at a consulting firm, you probably didn't feel that sort of leveling pressure as much as if you would if you were more senior. Another type of macro uncertainty you need to be okay with is career progression. So in consulting, like at Bain, for example, they had this incredibly detailed and rigorous skill tracker, which essentially tracked the growth of an employee from the very first year where they joined as an associate consultant, meaning the undergrad, post-undergrad role, all the way to being a partner. And it tracked your progression on every 6 months across the three different dimensions that we were rated on, which I think was like problem solving, teams, and client relationships or client results. But each of those 3 would have been broken down into like six subcategories, and each of those 6 subcategories had like 5 or 6 different like subcategories, and each of them would have like a bar or a description of where you should be based on how long you've been at the company in a specific role. Now, when you go into startups, that is not going to be there at all. You're going to have to monitor your own performance. You're going to have to go after your own learning opportunities. But often enough, the job itself at a startup is learning opportunity. You don't have to go out of your way for that. And the performance is something that you'll have to track as part of your job, because your job will be you being responsible for certain KPIs or outcomes, which, the tracking for should be as easy as possible. Or you should try to make it as easy as possible, both for the job and for your own sake. On the micro sense of uncertainty, the thing that former consultants will have to get used to, if they already haven't, is the fact that nobody will be looking over your shoulder and telling you exactly what to do. I think when you join consulting, it's funny, they like take these people who are otherwise incredibly high performers in undergrad, who are running clubs or president of their student body, so they're used to even having leadership positions, and then they take them down to an associate level where they can't even write an email on day one without it getting checked. And so I think consulting can really reduce your autonomy and your ownership and your freedom, which you will then need to very quickly get back if you go join a startup. And I think you do. You generally, after working at a consulting for a couple of years, you'll get that autonomy back. But you need to make sure to shed any level of hierarchical thinking or hierarchical structure when it comes to operating. You just need to go do. And I think that ties in with uncertainty, in that you won't have anyone telling you what to do. And if you do, it's probably not a good sign if you're working in a startup. I think the second thing, which is quite a simple one, that consultants need to be okay with whenever they're moving to the startup world, is just a lack of prestige. A lot of people like consulting and stay in consulting often because of the prestige that the job gives them, which I think is quite silly, to be honest. I think prestige isn't that important, but to each their own. But yeah, when you go work at a startup, no one's going to care. No one knows about it generally, unless you're at a really big stage, which I would even argue, like, if a lot of people know about it, then, unless it's like a Cluey or Cursor or something, then it's probably not a startup, and it's probably more in the growth phase, or, close to IPOing. The third thing that I think, and this one's super important that you unlearn, I think everyone who goes into consulting will unfortunately develop this habit that definitely needs to go when you go into a startup, is that you need to be okay having less certainty to make decisions. In a startup, the most important resource is time. And so the more decisions you're making, the more momentum you're making, the more learnings you have per unit time, the more likely you are to be successful and not default dead, which is what most startups are. Versus in consulting, yes, time is important and we do work fast, but the most important thing is always going to be making sure that the client is happy and that they're willing to both pay for the current project and pay for future ones. And what that means is making no mistakes, making sure that everything is incredibly polished down to the exclamation points and periods within a slide deck. Now, if you're focusing on that level of detail at a startup, that is just absolutely the wrong thing to be doing, except in maybe very, very edge or rare cases. But in this consulting world, that's just the norm. And so there are certain things that you need to unlearn when it comes to how much certainty or how much quality you need to get a specific outcome. Because in the consulting world, it's super different from the startup world. The fourth one, and again, an obvious one, is that you just need to be okay with getting much lower pay, much lower compensation when you go work at a startup. Now, I think the way that things are working in the world, and depending on what startup level you work at, whether it's a Series A, Series B, you'll actually probably get comped decently well compared to consulting. It might not be 100% of it, but it'll be close. But if you go work at a seed stage, pre-seed, Series A, then I think it's a different story. And then if you're like me, going and working at a company or a startup that's in a different country, you will definitely have different salary and pay expectations than you would working in consulting in the US, which is among the most highly lucrative salaries or careers that someone at an undergrad could have in the world. And then the last thing that, as a consultant who is going into startups, you should definitely keep in mind is that in the consulting world, obviously all you're doing is effectively strategy, which is potentially the why and the what of the work, but not necessarily the how. And so when you go work at a startup, you're going to have to go and figure out how to actually do stuff, not just figuring out and making the strategy for this customer segment that you want to go and enter, but also trying to talk to 10 customers in that segment in the next 2 hours. Right? If you can call them up on the phone or talk to them in the next 2 days, if you have to go and knock on doors, right? That's something that you don't do as a consultant, but you will have to do at a startup if you want to find success and get results. And so as a former consultant, you definitely need to shed off the notion that strategy is the most important thing, because in the real world, strategy doesn't mean anything if it doesn't go anywhere. And as a startup employee, you have to make sure it goes somewhere. Anyway, that's my thoughts on what it's like to go from consulting to the startup world. If there are any other ideas like this that you think are interesting for me to talk about as somebody who's done both, let me know. Otherwise, we'll continue making some more videos of these topics. Cheers.